Hi history students, I'm here at the Bodleian Library in Oxford talking to you about the next stage in our Tudor history class, the succession from Mary I to Queen Elizabeth, her half-sister. And this happens in November of 1558 as Mary dies and Elizabeth becomes queen. The Roman Catholic faction that was connected to Mary realized it would be impossible to put someone on the throne that would be able to take over for Mary and bring the Roman Catholic reforms to greater fruition. And so it fell to the young Queen Elizabeth, who was at Hatfield House, about 30 miles north of London, about 30 miles north of the Tower of London and so on. And she was staying at Hatfield House and became queen. And she had to build up her faction. And what I wanted to do in the next few minutes is just talk to you a little bit about the first challenge that they had, which was reforming religion. And then we'll have some conversation about that, hopefully. The first thing that Queen Elizabeth did is appoint William Cecil, her main counselor, her main advisor. And he took on different titles throughout her reign and eventually gave his office to his son. So 2 Cecils in a row through Queen Elizabeth's long reign until 1603. But at first he advised her to put the matter of religion to some measure of clarity. And the way they did that is first come in from Hatfield House into London, so that 30 miles, and they came in late November 1558, about 11 days after the death of Mary. And Elizabeth came into a procession, and weirdly there was an influenza outbreak in London at the time, which periodically came through all these early modern cities, and so the town was in a little bit of a disarray. But she came and consolidated her power and formed a ruling group. And one of the very first things she did is go to basically a Christmas service, which was later in the next month in December 25th. And when she did, she had the Bishop of London be her main official. And she told the bishop, hey, when you come into Mass and when we celebrate the Eucharist, don't raise your hands above your head with the Eucharist to show it to everyone, because in Roman Catholicism that had been associated with the moment of transubstantiation, the time in which Roman Catholics believed that the bread and wine that were elements on the altar were transformed through God's grace and power into the body and blood of Jesus Christ. And so that moment was talked about in the consecration, but also the elevation of the host. So she said, look, this is very associated with Roman Catholicism, and to make peace and to appease the Protestants in our realm, please don't do that elevation, just do a simple blessing of the bread. But the bishop did it anyway. He elevated the host, and she walked out of the service. And people noticed that and said, yep, Elizabeth has been leaning Protestant and she'll probably continue to do so during her reign. And that's what she did. And really this settlement of the religious issue between Roman Catholics and Protestants in England is talked about in a political sense as the Elizabethan Settlement, which is a series of acts and policies that go from 1558 to 1563. So a 5-year period in which they did political things involving Parliament, in which the Church of England was formed, and of course they did ecclesiastical or church-related things. They passed theological things, they talked about vestments, and they kind of settled the matter of religion in England. And what they did is essentially create a kind of a compromise between Catholicism and Protestantism, which we now know as Anglicanism, or the Church of England. And it has elements of both Protestant and Roman Catholic belief. For example, in 1559, Parliament passed something called the Uniformity Bill, and that said that everyone needed to use the same liturgy. And the liturgy they chose was the 1552 Book of Common Prayer that had been created by Thomas Cranmer. Now, he had been an archbishop and had been leading Protestant, and here in Oxford, not too far from here, he was executed by being burned at the stake for his beliefs under the reign of Mary. But they decided to bring back his Book of Common Prayer, and it became the centerpiece of Anglican worship into the 21st century. So that was something that they decided to do. They wanted everyone across England to use the same book so that they would be saying the same liturgical things, not only on Sundays, but other times when there were baptisms and weddings and funerals and other occasional services. So it was difficult to get that uniformity bill through. The House of Commons accepted it, but the House of Lords, which had many bishops, many of them leaning Roman Catholic, rejected it, and it only passed by a few votes, including probably some strong arming by Elizabeth, who apparently locked up some of the bishops temporarily, and so they could not vote for the uniformity bill, and it passed by just a few votes. Another thing they did is Elizabeth said, let's continue to use vestments. In other words, the ecclesiastical things that pastors and priests would wear in church, they thought that was good. They also thought stained glass and beautiful ornamentation in buildings was fine. And so many of the elements of Catholicism, sort of the look of Catholicism, was retained during the Elizabethan settlement and into the Anglican Church. And that's why if you go today to Westminster Abbey or another big church, like here in Oxford, we might go to St. Mary's University Church. It will have beautiful interior stained glass, an organ, beautiful carvings. It won't have statues to the saints on the aisles and things, but it otherwise will look a lot like a Roman Catholic church. And it was pretty easy to remodel the current churches so that they would conform to this new Anglican vision. So they had vestments, they had beautiful tableware on the altars. They continued with lots of the ceremonies that they had in the past. They were slightly modified. Now, Roman Catholics at this period technically were not allowed to practice their faith anymore, and so they essentially went underground and were supported by Roman Catholic missionaries from abroad. And the Pope in Rome kept telling Elizabeth after 1558, 1559, look, you need to conform, you need to come back to the faith like your sister did, or we will excommunicate you. And finally, in 1570, the Pope did use that tool, excommunication, to say that Elizabeth was no longer the head of the Church of England, and she could be hunted down and even assassinated if that was necessary to return England to Catholicism. So after 1570, obviously the relationship between the Church of England and Roman Catholicism soured. It soured between Elizabeth and the Pope, and from then on, Roman Catholics sort of went underground if they wanted to continue to practice their beliefs. But we know that they did, and many Roman Catholics were satisfied with their religion, particularly out in manor estates, and some of the nobles continued to practice that faith in their private chapels for hundreds of years, until in the early 1800s, Roman Catholicism was again allowed in England. Elizabeth called herself not the supreme head of the church in England, but the supreme governor, which was thought to be more sensible, more appropriate, perhaps even more appropriate for a woman to act as the governor rather than the head of the church. Now, some Protestants didn't like this idea, and they were frustrated with this Church of England, which seemed like a compromise to them. They thought it still looked too much like Catholicism. And so those within the Church of England that were frustrated with this settlement, and that wanted to purify the church and make it go back to its Protestant origins, which were happening during the reign of Edward VI, those people tended to be known as Puritans. So again, a Puritan in English history after the 1580s or so are those within the Church of England that are pressing to purify the church and just make it more Protestant, more in line with Calvinism or perhaps Lutheranism. And there were some places in Europe that happened. That happened in John Calvin's Geneva. It happened under John Knox in Scotland. But Puritans generally were treated suspiciously after the 1580s in England, and that's why some of them eventually left to what would become the United States of America, or the English colonies there. So that is a settlement that seemed to work very well for people that were in England at the time. People thought that they could practice, they could do it. And in terms of theology, Elizabeth said, I don't want to make windows into men's souls, I just want them to conform. That's kind of a loose translation of what she said. She didn't want to interview everyone and know what their theology was. She just wanted them to conform to some basic ideas and some basic rituals that they could follow. So the Elizabethan settlement of 1558 to 1563 was successful. It settled the matter of religion in England for several generations, and created what we now know today as the Church of England, which is one of the beautiful global Christian churches that we have access to today. Thank you for your attention, and I'll see you in the next video.